going to get right to it and introduce our artist for this evening. DM Witman is a transdisciplinary artist working at the intersection of environmental disruption and the human relationship to place. She has affiliations with Clump Ching Gallery in New York and Cove Street Arts, has received grants from Maine Arts Commission, the Kindling Foundation, the John Anson Kittredge Fund, and the Puffin Foundation. She also actively exhibits her work. So I'm going to keep it short, and I'm going to turn you right over to DM Witman.
Great, thank you. Yeah, thanks so much for joining. I'm going to work on sharing my screen here. And let's see, there we go. So hopefully you see, yeah, great, okay.
Yep, looks good.
So I thought tonight what might be helpful is to just give an overview of, sort of the work that I've made in more than, little more than a decade, and not necessarily focus on one particular series, but give you sort of a context for a life's work, right? How that builds over time, and that idea of one image or series at a time. And if you have questions, please feel free to put them in the chat. Dale's gonna jump in as she can, and I would welcome any questions. So yeah, so here we go. This is, many of you might already know that prior to teaching and trying to figure out what it means to be an artist, I was an environmental scientist, and I worked outside primarily conducting baseline studies for environmental clearance documents for projects like bridge replacements or airports, that kind of thing. And I was based just around Philadelphia. So I spent quite a bit of time, and that's where I grew up, in Pennsylvania, just outside of the city. And I lived there till my mid-30s. And so I just wanted to give this, that there, many people think that, art comes from art's sake, and really there's a passion, right? There's some interest, there's something that drives us to make. And so I'd like to just provide this to show that, yes, I've had a previous life, a previous career, if you will, and all that that I've learned, that I know influences what I do today. And so I would get to go out to really beautiful places like this, which is in Bucks County, Pennsylvania, and a place where I would go for my day job to look for endangered species, right? And plants were one of the things that I focused on quite a bit. And so it was, and one of my goals, in my early 20s, was to know every plant by sight, right? That I could go out there and I could name it by one simple sort of glance. And I did get good. I'm rusty now, but at the time I was good. And so I would see places like this, which just would totally inspire me. And then when I was off the clock, I could sometimes go back to these places if they were somewhat accessible. And I would make photographs like this. And at the time I was working with a large format pinhole camera and black and white film. And so these are all silver prints, silver photographs. And what I was really working with at the time was this idea of what a moment could be, and my relationship to the natural world. Because one of the things as a scientist that we're often, you see, or it's held culturally, is that, scientists can't have any opinions. They can't have feelings, right? There's this idea that science is sterile. And for me, that was really hard because of my, my creative impulses and the need to want to explore and expression. So science hasn't left me. It just has taken a different path, a different form, and it all sort of integrates eventually. So for me, it was figuring out this relationship to the natural world. How do I fit? How's the figure fit? How do I fit? And if you're not familiar with pinhole photography, it's simply any light, tight container that lets light in through a hole, and you get an image projected upside down on the back surface, which would be your film, or even you can make them digitally at this point. And so just to give you a sense as to what that would look like out in the field on the set, on the left is the pinhole camera on a tripod, and on the right is sort of me trying to figure out what that, what it might look like. And one of the great things that I loved when working with pinhole is that I couldn't see what I was getting, right? There was always this lag of time between the exposure on the film and the development. So it allowed me to work more slowly, which I do enjoy, right? I love the time element. And it was a challenge, right, to sort of pre-visualize, well, what am I going to get here? Where do I need to be? Where is the camera need to be? How is it going to be framed? And all these sort of, I guess I want to say challenges, but just logistics to work out. And, since I worked with this for probably more than 10 years, actually, and you do get kind of a sense as to what's, what might be happen in terms of the positioning, but you never really know how light is going to interact, right? Like where the specks of light or the streams of light, or, where they're going to end up, because the exposures are anywhere from an open and close to perhaps, could be 45 minutes, right? And just to go back, right? So something like this could have been a 20-minute exposure. And so there was some real physical, there was the physicality of it that's involved was really important to me. And in a way is, I would say performative, right? It's a performance in that there's a duration to each of these, poses, if you will. And this one, being in water. So the figure is floating in a water essentially here. And eventually, just to sort of revive, to continue my interest, I did switch to color, and that provided me with a whole new dictionary, right? A whole new vocabulary to draw upon to keep working in this project, the series that I called Ways of Being. And I always thought that would be something I worked on forever. And I might go back to it. I just consider at this point that it's on pause. And as I was working on this, I also came to, just to think about larger systems, right? Not just my relationship to the natural world, but larger relationships to creatures on this earth and celestial, celestial astronomic configurations. And this is a project that I did, I could say a series, a collaboration with slugs, right? Like common garden slugs that I would go out and collect in the evenings and bring back to the darkroom. And I was pretty much obsessed with knowing everything that I could possibly know. And this is where this research component comes into being, like that science, right? My need for information, but also the need for expression, right? The finding a balance. And so I've, everything that I could possibly find about slugs, the pH of their slime, their life cycle, where, anything I could find. And the internet is a great resource for that, of course. And my obsession was a pretty long one. I would bring those slugs in. Sometimes I would collect 5 at a time. Sometimes it could be 100. Just depend on, the climate conditions, the weather, what was happening. And I just, I made so many of these that ultimately, I was able to create this installation, and I called it Supercluster Arion. And supercluster is a term from astronomy, is one of those, it's an astronomic phenomena. And Arion actually is the genus for the slug. And so I'm combining, again, this name. And so here's where you can see it actually installed on a wall. Each of the pieces is mounted to anodized aluminum. And there's a little silver frame on the back that, just lets them be hung on the wall without any glazing. So these have been a challenge to actually exhibit because of the lack of glazing, right? No glass or plexiglass. And I really was interested, I'm just going to go back here, because what's interesting is that even after processing these as traditional silver gelatin photographs, they're washed and they're toned in selenium, there's still this great amount of organic matter that's left on them. You can see the slug slime. You can see in some instances some of their defecation. And that was really important to me, that there not be a barrier between the viewer and the actual object, the surface. And so when you see something like this, those little white pock marks is the slug eating the gelatin in the paper, right? So that's what they're responding to. And then you'll see that their slime can act as a resist. It can, their bodies, some of them just didn't move the whole time they were there, right? So I would collect them, put them in a contraption in my sink so that they couldn't get out, leave, of course, water sources for them to access. And sometimes they would move quite a bit, and other times not so much. And it was really just this dance to watch them, how they engaged with the surface, and the paper didn't kill them. They all survived, and then I would take them back out to where I collected them from. And I would try to, also I would change my collecting location so I wasn't collecting the same one over and over. And I just, in terms of, I think, process, for those who, are working artists or think about this, like the process of keeping notebooks, journals, sketchbooks, that it's really important, because you can find that, subconsciously you're thinking about things, and or so, that you don't even realize it. And then you go back and you can see the references. Like, this was something I found after I was making these. I was like, oh, I've been thinking about this, right? But I didn't really know that I was consciously thinking of it. And these, these sorts of inspirations or notes are really helpful in terms of understanding your work when you go back to it, right? If you're trying to figure out, well, what is this about? Why am I making it? What's the, what are the metaphors? Or these kinds of things can just be really helpful to guide you, right? Make suggestions to you. And this is an instance where you can see the trails, right? The slug slime acts as a resist when it's processed in all the chemistry. And so those pieces are 11 by 14. There's also a whole group that I made where you can see the references to the sketch that I made. These are round. They are also mounted to anodized aluminum. These are about 23 inches diameter. And I would say that these right now are up at going to be on exhibition at the Maine Museum of Photographic Arts. There's an exhibition coming up, I think on the 14th is the opening. So some of these will be there. And you can see that reference, right? Like, I didn't know I was thinking about all this, but here it is. And because I could, working in the silver darkroom, the controls, the tonalities I could control through the development process. So I could get ranges from these grays to the deep blacks that you might expect. Some of them are also, I have made as triptychs or diptychs, referencing again all these celestial phenomena. These are all terms that are used in astronomy. And I could just give you a little piece of this. This is just a bit about, if you're interested, I'm going to click here to speed it up, just about the, how sometimes we don't always know why we do things. But when I was doing this, I was taking my phone out, I was making these little snippets of, whether I was collecting the slugs or in the dark room. And then, and at the end of it, it's like, oh, wait a minute, I can make a little video of like the process, right? Like the documentation. And so this is, you can see here how the slugs actually move. This is all sped up. And I'm just gonna leave that there. And you can find this if you want to watch the whole thing. It's a few minutes on my website. Mostly I worked with the little tiny yellow slugs, which are common in Maine. But occasionally I wanted to do a really big piece. I wanted to do something large. So I had this really huge 7-foot piece of paper, and I put the slugs on the paper, and I used the really big gray ones that you'd get in a compost pile, right? The ones that everybody gets grossed out by. And just to see how different that would be. And what I discovered was that, well, I couldn't develop it well. So I actually had to cut it in half and process the two halves separately, which allowed me to make some modifications. It allowed me to experiment a bit again, a bit. So sometimes these things that happen that we're not expecting can really benefit us. And you just have to be willing, I think, to embrace uncertainty and that, that experimentation, that things may not work, but they might. I also have, and this is about the same time, I've been working with anthotypes for more than a decade. And I know those became really popular in the pandemic, because for those of us who were teaching, it was one of the safe things that we could actually do in sort of a process, hands-on process. And so plants being, really very much rooted, no pun intended, I guess no pun intended, there you go, rooted in my history, right? That it was something that I can draw upon, right? Like I have a certain amount of knowledge about identifying plants and knowing where to find them and, get what I want essentially. And so for anthotypes, for those of you who maybe haven't experienced those, you're basically taking up a part of a plant and you make an emulsion, a liquid. And you can do that through blending and using a mortar and pestle or cheesecloth or some strainers just to get a liquid. And this is, there we go. That's blueberries, Maine blueberries. And you coat the paper on the bottom left. You can see that the paper's dried. And then you take a digital positive and you place it on top of the emulsion and you let it live in the sun for a period of time. It could be a few weeks, a few days, a few months. It depends on your geography, the intensity of the sun at the time of year, and also just, what that plant that you've worked with is. All those are variables and they're pretty fun to work with. And I was invited to the 200th anniversary of Thoreau's birth. And I made a series with all kinds of different colors, blueberry and onion skin and huckleberries. And so it's something that, that is a slow unfolding process, can be quite rewarding. The images themselves are not permanent, they're ephemeral. So they will fade over time. I mean, I've had some in a box for 10 years and they still hold up, but as they're exposed to light and because they are organic, they will fade over time. And also, so all these things, one leads to another. Sometimes there's overlap. Sometimes there's a distinct start-stop point. This is one of those that is also a continuation. When I was working on the anthotypes, this also happened, where I saw this article in 2014 from the New York Times that, the title, The End of Snow. And I read it and it was a gut punch to me. And within seconds, really, I had this huge emotional response. Here is, I grew up in a city. This is my dad and I making a snowman with dirty alley snow, right? Because that's what we had, in the city, that's what you got dirty snow. But I was immediately thinking about my emotional connections, just my overall connectivity to the natural world, to weather. And what this climate scientist said was that in as little as 10 years, so that would be 2024, most of the Olympic winter sites where the Olympics have been held historically would no longer be cold enough or snowy enough. to have the Olympics, right? That's a big change, and we're just about there at this point. And so I immediately went to my notebooks, right? Sketched out a plan, and I started to research. I contacted the researcher. He's located in Canada, and he was very generous. He provided all of his, data for me, and that's how I started. I also was able to find out a great deal of information on the process I thought I wanted to use on the web, so I could go back to these historic sources like this one from 1890, which was really helpful. I used Google Earth, which was at the time a subscription basis. It's now free. And so I was able to travel to each of those locations via satellite imagery, right? I didn't have to physically go and sort of build up my carbon footprint, if you will. And so I spent the better part of a year working with salted paper, trying to figure it out. What papers did I like? What gelatin ratios did I like? What salt formulas did I like? All those variables, your water quality, whether you use tap water or distilled water, all these things have an impact on what that final image will look like. And it's a contact printing process. It's the earliest photographic process. It's 1837, right? It's Talbot's process for making photographs. And you brush, here I would be wearing gloves, but this is a still from a video that I had worked on. So I would be wearing gloves and coating the silver nitrate on the prepared paper, placing the positive on top and exposing in a UV unit. You can also use the sun, right, as Talbot did. But what this got me was, the ability to depict each of those locations for the Winter Olympics, right? To make a point that these things are no longer the same, and they wouldn't be. And I chose salted paper on purpose. It was really important to me that if the photograph was not fixed, right? It's not stable, it's not archival at that point, it will fade. And so in an exhibition, and I've shown these in a number of formats, sometimes they're framed, sometimes they're magnets to the wall. What it allows is for a discussion about the change. And I think at that time, really at 2014, 15, there was still so much discussion about, is climate change real, right? And I didn't want that to be a discussion. I was interested in, here we are in front of these pictures and they're changing in front of you and you can't deny it, right? And again, just going, always keeping notes about what I do and how I do it, formulas, any sort of things in case I need to go back. And these have saved me more than once, right? Because you think you're going to remember that ratio that you used, 6 months ago, but so much happens that, note taking is, I think, just so important in these processes. And so again, all from satellite imagery. They're about 21.5 inches long. And I found something really interesting. It was a whole other rabbit hole, was that particularly around Russia, when on my screen, I could see the landscape, but when I would save the images, there would be these disruptions, right? That there would be these pieces of data missing. And that I thought always could be a whole other series but it was one that I was like, okay, focus, you need to focus and keep going on what you're working on and not go down that rabbit hole. But the satellite imagery was really useful in terms of being able to depict these specific locations, the places, with knowing that it really could be anywhere, right? That these changes are happening across the globe. Here's an example of, on the bottom, is what a finished piece looks like in terms of it's archival, it's been processed toned in gold chloride, very stable and archival. If I don't fix it, this is what it looks like on the top, this beautiful red color, which I just automatically loved because of the, the color and the inference of red and hot and danger. And then here's an example of, the progression. So on the top, this is Mount Katahdin in the left. And then just in the middle, it's been printed, no light has hit it yet. And then the fading that happens over time, where the color stays, but the image, shifts and just sort of gets lost in the color. And how long it takes depends on the intensity of the light, how much light is hitting it for how long. It could take a few days, weeks, or months. It just that light variable is what matters. And I received I received 2 grants for this work, which I was incredibly grateful for, because they allowed me to really, work through that process. Metals, then were expensive, and now they're hugely expensive. The cost of silver and gold, it's just exorbitant. I don't know how I would print this today, to be quite honest, because the costs of the silver and the gold are just so high. One of the grants allowed me to take on my first really public participation component. I've been interested since then at multiple entry points, like how do we get people engaged, right? Just beyond gallery and museum walls. I want that engagement too, but I also want some other avenues. So I printed 250 postcards, and I didn't fix them. So what somebody got was the upper left, and I just mailed them out to people in these little packages that had some instructions and what the project was about, and asking people to consider, essentially, the metaphor is to consider, how do we make decisions in our daily lives that impact climate, right? Walking to the corner store, the coffee shop down the street, do we walk or do we drive, right? Those are decisions we make. And I wanted that here. And I really had hoped that I'd have a great, I was hoping for a really good response. And it wasn't quite as what I wanted, right? I didn't get quite as much dialogue as I was hoping. I did hear from a number of people, which was great. And because it went out to mostly people that I didn't know. I did send it to some people that I knew, of course, but I just sort of picked people. The good old fashioned phone book lets you still do those things. And so for me, that was a a lesson learned, like, okay, what might I do differently next time? How might I go about this? And then I found, after working on that I was stuck. I just stuck. I wasn't making anything. That melt work took me not quite a year to produce, edition of prints, all the postcards, the exhibition prints. And I worked pretty intensely for many months. And so I thought I was just taking a break. I just needed a break as an artist. I just a pause to breathe. But that pause turned into a longer period of time. And what I discovered was that, through a series of conversations and presenting at conferences and some, conversations with people that I just met, really, that something wasn't right. And so I started to dig in. When I discovered was that I was mourning, right? That work that I had undertaken was so powerful for me and overwhelming that I didn't realize it. Like, it took a mental, emotional, physical toll. And so I recognized, and I stumbled across the idea, this concept, the phenomena of ecological grief, or we might call it solastalgia, is another term. And as a way to kickstart myself into making, I decided to go back to something that I knew and that I loved and that I thought could help me process the grief. So there's this little patch of intertidal marsh along the studio where I worked in Maine, along these banks of the St. George River. And, again, referencing all these things in our lives, right, can be very informative in our practice, right? I didn't stop caring about plants. I didn't stop caring about, or wanting to know how to identify them, but I did have to really dig in and dust, shake off the rust, if you would, right? Dig in there and retrain myself to do these things. So what I decided to do was to collect one of each species of that patch of marsh, not even a quarter of an acre, right? But many, many species, with the idea that, it's coastally, it's a tidal river. And that place is at the head of tide. So the head of tide is like where you witness that it's like the last stretch of a river where you notice the tidal influence. And the tide can be anywhere from, the tidal difference can be as little as a foot to 7 feet, depending on, or 9 feet even, depending on the day and time of year. So it's less than 2 miles from the ocean. And as the water rises, right, these species aren't going to make it, right? They just won't adapt fast enough. And so I decided to pull on my experience of that research. When I would look for threatened and endangered plant species, I would go to herbaria and I would look at the specimens. What did they look like? Where were they found? And so I wanted to mirror that with these. I wanted them to be both data and memorials, right? And that's why there's a label there that I've made that mimics the data that you would find on a true herbarium sheet. And you can see, just for scale, they're pretty large. The largest, I made these in 2 sizes, each is unique. The largest is 26 inches on the long edge, so that contact frame is pretty big. It fits a full sheet of 22 by 30 paper. It's a beast to move around, but very important in the process. So these are photograms, right? It is an actual contact of each plant. And they have a weight. So these are gum bichromate. And, I've painted many layers of a mixture of chromate and gum arabic and pigment to make that color. And so it was important for me to just have this record, to recognize that, yes, there's going to be change. Yes, some of these things aren't going to make it. And there's a sadness to that. And even if you might think, more globally with this idea of ecological grieving, that, it's a real existential crisis for some of us. I don't want to say everyone, because not everyone has that same kind of connection. But I would say it really is an existential crisis, right? That, how are we as humans going to deal with this? And I found that once I had a framework to start talking about grief, about, I had models and I had some language and I understood it a little better, I was able to start talking with others. And that led to a collaboration with a colleague who was a psychologist where I was teaching. He was a teacher and he specialized in loss. And so we got a few small grants, and I designed this zine that paired some of my images with models of psychology. This is a really important one, because this one highlights that grief is not linear. And you can spend a lifetime grieving, right? There can be an end point, but there isn't always. And that one day you can be living life and feel really excited and you're making friends, but in other days you may not feel so great, right? That there's this oscillation back and forth. And this was really instrumental for me in terms of processing and continuing to work, because there is hope, right? Yes, there's this mourning aspect, but there's hope. So my colleague and I took our show on the road, and because I was thinking, geez, I can't be the only person who feels this way. And I felt so isolated, right? I was like, I couldn't talk to people about it because I didn't understand the whole thing, and it was dark. But we went out to mostly our public libraries and invited communities to come join us. And my colleague would talk about the psychology aspect, how the field is dealing with it, how as individuals they might deal with it. And then I was speaking about how artists are dealing with it. And we had some prompts for our community members, and they produced some really terrific artifacts that I think we thought we might use in the future. But the pandemic sort of just, with everything just interrupted, everything. And as this was happening, I also embarked on this, it's sort of simultaneously, this next series, also, climate oriented and awareness and centered around loss. These are from an archive that I utilized from the first known photographs of icebergs from 1864. They're in salted paper and have hand-painted gum bichromate over top. It's two processes that I've had shown previously. And here's just a little video like of painting, right? It's multiple paintings, multiple layers, and then you expose it to light and you do it again, and you're building up tonality essentially. It's a small suite, just 10 images, which felt enough for me. With some of the other work, I recognize that it's more conceptual and one might need to read, and look. And these, I really just wanted more of a visceral response, that one could look and, sort of just feel it, right? That something maybe isn't quite right. As I'm continuing to work, right, I'm also working in video and installation. I think all of these for me are an important part of my practice moving forward, just addressing these issues and this life's work, right, in any way that I can that feels organic. And so I'm just going to share a little bit here. I'll scroll through that. This is, of course, I recorded this during the pandemic after I had COVID, and was feeling better from a little better from COVID. But this idea that grief can take many forms, and in some cultures, the cutting of one's hair is an expression of that grief. And so I wanted to just get at that one more way. And so video was another way for me to do that. And I'm just going to turn the sound on a little bit here. And I'll pause here. That I shared this there was an exhibition at the Newport Art Museum called The Culture of Hair. And it was really terrific for this to be a part of it, because there are many, many artworks that were just tremendous. And that sound of the razor punctuated the space, right? So people didn't necessarily know where it was coming from, but you could hear it. So as people looked at the other artworks, they could hear this. And then finally at the end, you would come to this piece and just, understand where it was coming from. I continue to work with all three realms, and I'm just going to scroll through this one too, in terms of, video and still imagery and sound, and any way that I can address it and that it feels authentic to me. This piece is too, just it's also split screen. And the bulk of this, the change that you notice is that the iceberg, I'm sorry, the ice block that I made that I'm standing on, shifts to red. And again, it's like, it felt like a natural for me, right? Going back to those pinhole pictures, right? Their performance, there's a performative aspect. When you're having to be still in your body and mind for 30 minutes to get that frame, that duration, that's, there's a performative aspect there. And so it felt very natural for me to come back to something like this, but just maybe in video. So I'm going to, I guess, let's see, here is kind of coming to a close, and just curious at this point if anybody has any questions.
So if anyone has questions, you can put them in the chat, type them in, and I can relay them, or there's a raise hand function. So if you want to actually ask them with your voice, you can use the raise hand function that can allow you to unmute yourself. I'll say that it's interesting because you're using different processes sort of depending on the project that you're working on. How do you decide what process is most appropriate for your different projects?
I think each series, each idea has it happens, I would say, organically. Like I'm allow it to sort of just, I can think about it. Sometimes, for instance, with melt and the satellite imagery, I automatically knew what process I would use because there was a certain end goal, right? That idea of not fixing the image. And so for me, that was a natural pairing. The other processes, whether it's video or gum or silver gelatin, it really does happen, I would say, organically. I let it unfold. I let the idea, for me, the idea is first and the process comes next.
Do you ever find that you try something in one process and maybe that doesn't feel right and shift to another, or does it kind of come clearly to you?
Yeah, I would say in all of these instances it was clear, but there are things I've tried, that maybe just I'm not happy with, right? They don't work out, like these experiments that you're just like, oh, I'm going to try this process in this paper and let's see what happens. And then either it's amazing and I'm like, okay, I can do something with this later, or I'm like, I'm going to, it's just not working and I'll abandon it for now. Right. But I always say, I tend to save everything. I just save everything. I don't throw anything away because time has an amazing way, for me at least, of allowing things to stew, right? Like if I go back to those pinhole pictures, I probably have over 1,000 negatives. I probably printed, maybe 100, because at the time I was like, 10 years ago, I was in a different place and I was like, oh, I really like this one, don't like that one. And you print what at the moment. And when I've gone back through them, like over the pandemic, I had a chance and I was like, why didn't I print that? Why didn't I print that? Right? It's like this. So I tend not to throw things away and I keep things because they might be useful later.
Ellen has a somewhat related question specific to focus. She said, did the focus pieces begin as silver gelatin prints with bichromate?
The focus.
What series was that?
The elegy pieces with the icebergs. Are those the ones?
Ellen, can you clarify which series you're referencing? We'll give Ellen a second to jump in and clarify, but in the meantime, Pamela, oh no, sorry, the native plants.
The native plants. So the question was, can you say that again?
Did the focus pieces begin as silver gelatin prints
No.
with? Okay.
No, those were only ever gum bichromate. because
Okay.
I knew that I wanted them to be dark and heavy and also beautiful. And I knew that I could achieve that with gum. Right. I just knew it, and I started, and it worked.
Mm. So I think it's the familiarity with what each process can deliver is kind
Yeah,
of
I think
key to.
that's true.
Mm.
Yeah.
Um, Pamela has a question. Your plant contact prints seem to extend the work of British 19th century cyanotypes of Anna Atkins, who worked to illustrate her father's botanical collection. Do you see yourself in any historical tradition?
Well, I haven't. I mean, I'm certainly aware of Anna Atkins' work, is recognized as the first female photographer, and was until 10 years ago really not recognized, didn't get the recognition she deserved. I think this just recently, I was at Photo Fest and in Houston, and the Museum of Fine Arts Houston, and they had acquired a piece of mine, one of the botanicals, and they were using it in um, there was an exhibition there where they're drawing on the history of photography, um, and pulling out a lineage from their collection. And I have to say, I think it was maybe the first time that I considered the work in that context, having someone else do it rather than me saying this is where I belong. It felt more natural. And I've appreciated that. And the exhibition is beautiful. And there's everything from daguerreotypes to digital. But it really was, I guess I would say, to reiterate, it was the first time that I thought of the work in a context like that, and it was helpful.
Mm.
Yeah.
Should I see a hand pop up and then pop back down? Maybe not. All right, if anyone has questions or even comments you'd like to put in the chat, I'll save the transcript and share it afterwards. So if you have anything that's not necessarily a question, but a comment, you could put that in the chat as well.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Gail, for inviting me, and it was
Oh,
really
you're
wonderful.
welcome. Yeah, no, it was great to see such a wide breadth of work.
Great.
All right, so thank you, everyone, and hopefully we will see you again soon.
Terrific. Thank you.
All right, thanks. Good night.
Good night.